good morning, good afternoon, and good night, depending where you are. I'm Dr. Tom Verhelst, and I'm here with Associate Professor Amir Ariani, and we'll be talking about working with people-centric data in the new normal. First, we should probably talk a little bit about what is the new normal in data. And it's basically, we believe it's mainly being driven in the past by just focusing more on people, but I think the last couple of months, the COVID-19 epidemic has really changed how we look at data. And I think, well, at least before I looked at data just professionally, and now I just have a daily intake of stats to just look at how COVID is doing around the world. That has its benefits and its side effects. I mean, sometimes you sort of start feeling depressed, but at least it shows you what's going on, and it really brings numbers to life. And I think a lot of people around the world have really gotten used to sort of looking at numbers in a different way. It also, I think in the past, policing has always been people-centric because you sort of are looking at the perpetrator or the victim of a crime, and then you sort of have to follow clues. But in general, decision-making and policy-making hasn't really been done in an individual way until now. I think, at least in Australia, it's quite amazing what's been done around the sort of tracking of people and the sort of contact tracing. I mean, people say, well, people should contact trace, but it's not really straightforward. You sort of have to combine flight details, these sort of passenger arrival sheets, which people write down on, and at least, for some people like me, that have bad handwriting, that's not really great. Then you have things like COVID safe apps, which have their own limitations and, show interactions between devices and potentially display interactions between people. And then you have the check-ins in restaurants and other public venues where, you write your name down or you do a digital check-in. And all of these things have to be combined in a way that sort of show who's contacted who, so an action can be taken. And I think until this year, that hasn't really been done outside of policing. And I think it really shows potential a lot of decision-making and policy-making and just interventions from government, but also on business in general. So at least in Australia, that's been a big success. And as long as the sort of number of infections is smaller number of people trying to contact trace, you can catch up and sort of be proactive and actionable. In places like the US, where the numbers get too big, then it sort of becomes a responsive thing and more observational. Which brings me to the current state. I think the current state for us in the work we do is still very much place-based. So instead of looking at individuals, we sort of aggregate individuals up to things that we call suburbs, or in Australia, we call them statistical areas, which is the specific definition of a specific geographical place. And then we sort of try and find patterns and sort of try and find actionable insights for government, business, service providers. And that's the sort of work we do. An example of this, which is sort of combining economics data with social service data, is an app we made in Queensland. I think the sort of push towards people centricity has pushed us, at least, to make this very granular. So in the past, this would usually be made statewide. And if you look at, numbers that come from the federal government, they're usually on the country level or on the state level. But we've sort of trying to push that further and go very place specific. So we're trying to look at individual places. So we basically can get individual cities, which can be quite small. They can be, around 15,000 to 20,000 people. And we did that because the socioeconomic impact of COVID-19 is really not obvious. Like the sort of previous indicators that follow a certain trajectory cannot really be followed just because the sort of influences are really not obvious. So for that reason, we've looked at doing it maybe more granular. This is one that's from a fellow countryman of mine, which is a Belgian. And I mean, this is a 2016 election, so it's a bit old, but this is the US election. And on the right side, you see the traditional sort of looking at votes in the sort of looking at geographical areas. which is really not really interesting, because you're sort of talking about votes of people, and they don't really correlate well to how much space there is. And on the left hand side, it's sort of the same sort of map, but then looked at, the number of people, which I think is the sort of people centricity that is really expected from data science more and more. It's the right hand side it's interesting, but it's not as accurate as the left hand side. Which brings us to something that's going on in Australia, which is the Data Availability and Transparency Bill. And what this will do, or will try to do, is basically professionalize how data is exchanged between government entities. So until now, it has still been sort of a challenge to exchange data between government agencies and even universities and businesses. So this will sort of try and professionalize that in a way, by allowing data exchange, or at least harmonization of data exchange between government agencies, first at the federal level, but hopefully soon at the state level. And the good news for us is that universities and businesses are not excluded from this. So the initial idea of this bill will be to sort of improve the delivery of government services and inform policies and programs, but also allow research and development. And it will allow us to do things that in some countries already have been done, which is, you could combine social service data with health data, with education data, with social services data, and potentially business data. And you could create things that we're all used to in other aspects of our lives, where we have apps or digital platforms where information is brought together in a seamless way. We can basically see what we're entitled to, what we're not entitled to. This sort of legislation will allow government, but also businesses, to sort of develop these sort of solutions, which will be way more people-centric than they are now, where, now you go to a platform and you sort of have to figure out where you fit within the process, and you'll have to sort of define, okay, how do I apply for a new license, or where do I go for a certain service? This sort of technology could really change that, and at least in the disadvantaged space, help a lot of people. So we're very hopeful that new legislation comes to pass soon. The other benefit, of course, if you put all that data together, the potential for policymaking and researchers to have that data combined is really unprecedented in Australia. So it's something that's on the horizon, which leaves me to hand over to my colleague for his part on data co-ops.
Okay, thanks, Tom. Thank you. So Tom mentioned about how the data can be presented in different forms, from the GIS perspective to the linear analytics, and then what kind of application you can have from those derivative knowledge from the data. Now, in the next couple of slides, I'm going to talk about how we can actually do this in a targeted way, how we can actually have a strategic approach to connect data from people and organizations together in order to create benefits, and in our case, more specifically, create social good. So the idea of this concept around the data collaborations in the social space and in the not-for-profit sector came from some of the activities happening in GovLab in New York University. And in Australia, we have adopted this concept and we gave it a more Australian flavor, and also we kind of augmented the concept with introducing the concept of collective impact. So basically making the activity very much targeted toward producing results. So the concept of data co-op as kind of established almost about 2 years ago was the kind of coalition of organizations or individuals that they bring their data together, and there's a very specific goal or purpose for this data activity. Usually for a data co-op to happen, you need the data, and this data can be from the organizations or from individuals. Then you need people in that sense, which these are the people who are actually going to use the data. These are the community leaders, they are the domain experts, these are the researchers. And then we need analytics capabilities. And this is usually where the university comes to play with artificial intelligence and high performance computing. And then the idea is that this would be in principle, something equivalent to what the big enterprises and corporates such as Google and Microsoft have by capability of having access to the large volume of data. But here we are trying to provide the same capability to the not-for-profit sector, and basically under the umbrella of data for social good, make the data and the collaboration with people as a first-class citizen in driving the social impact and collective impact. So on that note, Tom, can you go to the next slide? Next, yes. So to make this happen, so in principle, this was the idea, but to make it happen, we actually adopted the co-design model. And we, right now, we actually have a ARC-funded projects across 5 universities. Swinburne is leading this with collaboration with Griffith, ANU, University of Melbourne, and UTAS. And we have basically the infrastructures and the methodology that enables these data co-op projects. The way that it works is that we get the data from a number of different sources, and often in this, the initial starting point is the public data. We have the data from the government sources, such as the ABS data. The data comes from the Orin platform. The data comes from the data.gov website. We have some of the information donated and provided from the not-for-profit sector, and we have a social media data. And often we have the area of activities and interested parties into the project. These are the kind of ingredients of the data co-op. For example of this can be the regional project related to the mental health or social well-being. What we do is that we take the data, we start the co-design workshop processes. When we work with these partners, we basically present different analytics that are kind of a starting point of the conversation. And we see how different insights that we can drive. For example, if it is mental health, well, what are the correlations between the mental health services in the region and demographic of people, or the PBS information, or the data that actually provided by the council in that region. Now, these are the ingredients for a starting conversation. And usually we get different feedbacks from different groups who are involved in the data co-op. Those feedbacks or information goes back to the data engineers and goes to data analysts. And this is kind of the iterative process that in each iteration, we basically create dashboards, data products, and visualizations that provide insights for that communities on that topic. Usually, as we go through this process, these insights individually can be drivers for change, and that includes policies or different procedures, optimization in services, or even creating new initiatives in the area. Now, what you see on the page in the bottom part is an example of this kind of interactive dashboard. Actually, I think I have a slide about this. Tom, can you go to the next one? Yeah, this is a good one. Okay, so this is a project we ran in the area LGA of the Glen Ira. And the aim of this was understanding the social resilience of the communities. So we work with different partners in the council and work with different groups to understand what are the priorities for different communities and how we can actually measure that. So this looks at the different factors, like things like the aging, disability, having the social connections in the area, how recently you have actually moved or immigrated to those suburbs. Are you employed? How much actually saving you have? So all of these factors together start to build a model for measuring the social resilience. But what the most important point was, we actually started to finding the need for given insights for different groups that can drive the policy. Like what you see in the left here is that there's an interactive dashboard that shows the low-income single-parent households. And that particular information speaks to given groups in Glen Ira that they need to support this community. So the number of these insights and number of these dashboards are the data-driven information, came from the information from people, and the aim is that they actually make the change, better change for the communities, especially vulnerable communities and families. Now, if you go to the next slide. Now, there are also opportunities for doing this in more coordinated level at the government stage. Like this is a project that we had in Canberra related to understanding of the health services and how do they actually align with the community's met and unmet needs. So in this project, we had a very much health focus, and the goal was looking at, again, socioeconomic data, information from the different health problems, but also from the health services. And you try to match them. It's another example of actually making the impact in policy, trying to actually provide insights about, well, the data that we get from people and the data that we get from organization, what is going to tell us where are the gaps and where the actual community or organizations who are involved who can make a difference. The idea around all of these projects is that while we want to actually preserve this privacy and security of the data to the utmost possible level, at the same time, we want to actually open the gate for having the public value from the data. There's a lot of value available in public data sets that if they have been used or if they are going to be used ethically and following the guidelines, as Tom mentioned, both from the Australian legislative guidelines, but also from the global and international guidelines. Following all of those guidelines and following the privacy lens of this and also the ethics. And if you follow all of these, still there's a lot of opportunity for bringing data together and actually provide value. Now, on that note, I'm going to pass the microphone back to Tom. Tom, it's yours.
Thank you. So I'll try to show you two more examples of data co-ops. I'll actually try and show, see if this works, and this works. I'll try and show some live stuff. That's always a bit risky, but let's see where we go. So this is an example of work that we've done with a local community organization called Logan Together that's focused on kids between 0 and 8 in Logan. So Logan is an area in southeast Queensland, the area that's coloured. And basically we created dashboards for them that allows them to advocate for change and make decisions. So as they focus on kids, we can, for example, show the number of children born in 2018, and then we can overlay that with things like childcare service centers. And this specific scenario shows that there's a lot of children born in the southern end of town, while most of the childcare centers are in the northern end of town. This might seem a bit counterintuitive, but the southern end of town is sort of, very new development. So they're sort of flattening the area and they're basically urbanizing that very quickly, which is why the services are lacking. So there's a whole bunch of other sort of indicators I could overlay, like need for alcohol and drug services. They would show very similar patterns, but it's very strong because instead of just having someone complain about this, you can really visualize it and you can bring this sort of map. You could take a picture, you could put it in a newspaper, but you could also bring this on an iPad to a decision maker or policy maker and say, well, if you really want to improve the outcomes of kids on the southern end of Logan, maybe we should put some more childcare centers there. So that's an example of the work we try to do with community organizations. An example of the work we try to do with researchers is, this is an example of one of our researchers has created a sort of measurement framework that shows how healthy or unhealthy food is in a certain outlet. So it can be restaurants or grocery stores. And then they basically have a high score green, a medium score orange, and then a low score red. And then we can sort of map on top of that the number of people living with diabetes. So red means more diabetes, darker blue or darker black means less diabetes. And you can sort of see if there's less possibilities for healthy food and there's more diabetes. So again, it doesn't really change the world immediately, but it definitely allows to have conversations that were previously quite difficult or harder to have. It's also a lot harder to ignore a map like this. And it really helps drive a certain narrative that you want to portray to sort of improve outcomes in certain communities. And I think with that, we could probably move to Q&A. So those two slides, before I do that, those two apps or those two links are sort of in the slides. In the slides, they're sort of a screenshot. If you would want to have a look at the specific applications, there's a link on the slides. Jeremy, how do we do Q&A?
While we are actually waiting for the questions, I just also realized one more thing to mention is that the data co-op platform that Tom and I mentioned, it has 5 universities involved in it, but potentially this is open to the wider communities, including other universities and government agencies. And we have ARC-funded resources that we can allocate to the data co-ops in this space. So if you are interested to get involved, contact either of us, and then we can actually help you in forming these data co-ops. We got one thing. Wait, from Angela. So Angela, yes and no. So some of them are. So none of them are commercial. Everything that I have mentioned so far are kind of derived from either not-for-profit organizations or created by the government funding. But some of them include sensitive information, like, for example, the one that I showed about the mental health and health services. We can't share that publicly yet, as it is still in progress. So we would be able to share with you some of those, but not all of them. Again, if you contact us, I think we can actually individually share with you different information as we go through this. Some of those informations are, although they came from public data, but the way that they actually constructed, they provide particular insights that we have to be careful about. Basically, the communities that they would have access. So the data that this information provides about the communities might actually compromise privacy of some of those communities. So we don't actually publicly make all of the data accessible, but a lot of it is already accessible.